Administration as chaotic as this one, it can sometimes be hard to tell on a day-to-day basis when things are going bad in just kind of a run-of-the-mill way versus when things are going bad in a not at all run-of-the-mill, maybe actually consider panicking kind of way. It's hard to tell sometimes on a day-to-day basis, but one of the good indicators that something really big is going wrong is when you get news that people who have really big jobs in one part of the government, they all leave. They all quit or are fired suddenly, all of a sudden and without warning. And it's because they had been trying to stop something from happening. They weren't able to stop that thing from happening, and so now they have left the agency. They have left the government. That is a pretty reliable sign that something quite big and quite bad is happening. And you only see these things every so often, even in an administration as disastrous as this one. For example, there were the senior prosecutors who resigned after the Justice Department ordered them to drop the corruption case against New York City's mayor. There was the longtime official who resigned from the Treasury Department after people working for the president's top campaign donor demanded access to the most sensitive payment systems in the whole U.S. government. There was the top official for vaccine safety in the whole U.S. government who said he would not give Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his new team unrestricted read-write access to a very sensitive central vaccine database. And again, I'm no expert, but I feel like I can measure the size of the splash that's being made by this particular cannonball at the IRS by the news of who is leaving the agency all of a sudden and without warning because of something going wrong there. This news started to come in last night, just as we were getting off the air, when we got news that the acting head of the IRS was gone. She had resigned over a Trump administration plan for the IRS to give sensitive tax data to immigration authorities, so the Trump administration can use it to target immigrants. This woman had been acting commissioner for less than 6 weeks. She had been appointed after Trump's previous acting head of the IRS also abruptly resigned in another controversy. That alone is a bad sign. But apparently she was not the only senior person at the IRS who left because of this standoff. The New York Times then reported that the IRS's chief financial officer, the IRS's chief of staff, the IRS's chief risk officer, all have also resigned in recent days. Same with the IRS's chief privacy officer. The top lawyer at the IRS was also reportedly demoted recently as this plan to use tax data to target immigrants was starting to come together. Now, that's a lot of people to have to fire your way through, right? Whatever the reason for all these high-level resignations, whether it's to stop this plan for using tax data to go after immigrants, I don't know. I feel like I need to understand why that is so dangerous and why so many people, including people elevated during the Trump administration, might feel like that was the hill they needed to die on. That was the reason they needed to leave the agency. So I have questions about that. The other thing going on, happy April, happy tax season, is that they appeared to just be also kind of wrecking the IRS wholesale in the same way they've been taking apart the Social Security Administration. And I understand the implications of that for Social Security, right? It means disabled people and old people are not going to get the checks they need that pay their rent and pay for their food and pay for their medicine. And in some cases, that's the only income they have. That's why the dismantling and the wrecking of the Social Security Administration is such a five-alarm moral fire for everybody, a five-alarm moral fire for everybody in this country who has a drop of empathy or understanding as to our obligations as citizens to people who have paid into Social Security and deserve those benefits and deserve not to be messed with. I get it at the Social Security Administration. At the IRS, we are seeing a similar kind of wrecking ball start to level that administration. I mean, the Trump administration is cutting a quarter of the people who work there. That has implications, among other things, in terms of how much tax revenue is expected to be brought in by the IRS. If tax revenue nationwide drops by 10% because of the way they are wrecking the IRS, what does that do to the country? This happens alongside the Justice Department, talking about now about effectively closing the whole tax enforcement division at the Justice Department, which is the part of the Justice Department that prosecutes tax crimes. So we're wrecking the IRS We're doing something so controversial at IRS that it has caused the mass exodus of all of the top executives at the agency, including some of whom came on board or got their current jobs during Trump. And we're going to stop prosecuting tax crimes. I should mention tax day is less than a week away, right? What happens to our country if the Trump administration breaks the IRS, if we don't have an effective and functioning system for collecting taxes or just for enforcing the rules and tax laws? What happens to our country then? What's the end game there? Why would you do this? Joining us now is Nina Olson. She's executive director of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. She previously served as the National Taxpayer Advocate of the United States, which is an independent organization within the IRS. Ms. Olson, thank you very much for being with us tonight. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm no expert in these matters. I am an interested observer watching these things just as a layperson reading the news and trying to understand it here. I have to ask if you feel like I'm focusing on the wrong things, if I'm being unduly alarmed by some of the things that I'm seeing in the news that to a tax professional such as yourself maybe should seem more benign.
No, I think this is unprecedented. First, the attack on tax return information, the confidentiality of it. If there's one thing that all IRS employees and executives know, it's to keep that information confidential. Taxpayers file their returns with the expectation that the IRS is going to abide by the law, which says tax return information is confidential unless Congress has carved out an exception. And that's drilled into you from day one. So that's the first thing, that we're talking fast and loose about, sharing information with all sorts of agencies and creating some kind of big database in the sky that federal agencies can tap into. That will lead to taxpayers not being willing to share as much information as they are now because they're afraid that it might get into other agencies and have consequences. And then you see the reaction of the senior leadership of the IRS. First, the duly nominated and appointed commissioner steps down, even though he had a 5-year term. And then you have the acting commissioner step down, and now you have a second acting commissioner step down because of the desire for the tax return information to be shared with ICE, Department of Homeland Security and ICE. And it's not just the chief risk officer who stepped down or the chief privacy officer, but the head lawyer in the IRS who opines on and interprets the section of the Internal Revenue Code that deals with confidentiality. She has also stepped down. So the legal expert on this provision that is under attack has stepped down.
On this point of confidentiality and, the seriousness with which this has been greeted by senior IRS personnel. When Nixon tried to weaponize the IRS commissioner at the time refused. Even Nixon didn't try to, Saturday night massacre the IRS and go through person after person and after person to get his way. Even he was rebuffed here. With all of these people resigning, with the confidentiality concerns that you describe, I feel like, again, just as a layperson looking at this, the immediate next place I go here is to the law. Because as far as I know, the confidentiality of tax information isn't just a nice thing that we like because it encourages people to pay their taxes because they believe they can trust the government to keep all their data safe. Violating the confidentiality of tax information is illegal, isn't it?
It's criminal. It's a criminal violation. And, you referenced, Nixon. A lot of people focus on the enemies list, but the other thing that happened that led to the current statute was that the Agriculture Department in the 70s asked for the tax returns of every single farmer in America. And that led to 2 or 3 congressional hearings, a huge outcry, like, why do you want this information? And that's what led to Congress enacting Section 6103, clawing the ownership, if you will, the decision-making about how to keep, who gets tax return information. They put it squarely in Congress's hands and said, it's confidential unless we pass an exception to this, rather than the president being able to decide. Up to 1976, the president got to decide.
Nina Olson, Executive Director of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. Thank you for your time tonight. Thank you for your clear speaking on this. This is I think, an intimidating topic for a lot of people because we all get intrinsically fearful when we start thinking about the IRS. The destruction of it, though, the dismantling of it is a totally different matter, and you've really helped me understand it better. Thanks for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
I will also say that, to the extent, as Ms. Olson says, this is a criminal matter to violate the confidentiality of tax information, of sensitive tax information. Anybody in the Trump administration, any Trump administration official who's considering sharing tax information in a way that violates the law, that makes this a crime to do it, you should know that Donald Trump is not going to be president forever. And the statute of limitations for most crimes is, in most cases, about 5 years. So maybe you're counting on not getting prosecuted for doing this, for breaking these laws about the confidentiality of tax information because you think Donald Trump's president, so who's going to prosecute you? Donald Trump won't always be president, and if the statute of limitations hasn't run, somebody else will.